Hello, this is Movie Thoughts. My name is John Hastings. This is my podcast that is sloppily filmed and recorded and hopefully intermittently interesting, where I ramble on about movies, theories about movies, movie related ideas. This is the 25th episode. Some of the times I try to prepare a little bit for the episodes I do. Most of the episodes I try to do some preparation, come up with some ideas and some notes, and just something to keep me on the right track so I don't ramble on too much. Other times, though, I just come up with an idea, often just the day of, and see what comes out just by talking. And that's kind of what I'm doing today. This is one of those episodes that I didn't plan much in advance. I was just kind of sitting here and thinking like, oh, this would be an interesting episode, and it comes out of. I want to talk about two movies that I saw recently. They were two movies that kind of shamefully I'd seen just for the first time recently. I feel I should have seen them years ago. Both have seen them a long time ago, and they fit together. When I mention them, you'll see why I wanted to talk about them together. And those movies are two sort of vampire movies from the 1980s. The Hunger, which is directed by Tony Scott and has Catherine Deneuve and Susan Sarandon and David Bowie, and then Near Dark, which is a Catherine Bigelow movie with Bill Paxton and Lance Henriksen and Jenny Wright, and that's from a little bit later in the 1980s. I saw them. I actually saw Near Dark first, and then watched The Hunger. And it's like I say, it's kind of shameful to admit that this is the first time I've seen them, especially for The Hunger, because I'm really a huge Tony Scott fan, and I'll talk about that one first. I think they're both kind of interesting to talk about for a variety of reasons, and I'll talk about The Hunger first. So the Hunger, like I say, 1983. It was not a big hit necessarily on release and had mixed reviews, mostly kind of leaning towards the negative reviews. I think Roger Ebert thought it was pretty silly, and one of the nicer things I found someone said about it was Mike Srago said that that Tony Scott has kind of so many ideas about how he wants to present the story that he doesn't actually get around to telling the story. So it's a little bit of a backhanded compliment. But I think that's an interesting place to start because my experience of The Hunger, and like I say, I'm a huge fan of Tony Scott. I love his work, and some people actually have come around to thinking that um, The Hunger is his best film. I've heard a number of folks make that argument that The Hunger is Tony Scott's best film. When someone's first feature is brought up as their best film, I often see that as a backhanded compliment in a way. Like they got it right the first time and they should have stopped there to a certain extent. And interestingly, that's sort of how I feel about. In the case of Tony's brother, Sir Ridley Scott, I feel that The Duelist is his best film. And I don't mean it as a backhanded compliment because I really do like Blade Runner, and I love a lot of the later Ridley Scott movies. I love The Counselor and The Martian, and I think Prometheus is very interesting. So there's a lot of Ridley Scott movies I like quite a bit. But I do think maybe I think The Duelist is his best overall work, the most fully satisfying movie he made. So hearing that some people I respect think that The Hunger is Tony Scott's best movie, or some people think it's maybe his only good movie. I was, you know, feel like I should have seen it a lot earlier. I guess is my point. Well, I'm getting around to it now, and my thoughts are kind of from start to finish, or kind of going through the thoughts I had while watching it from start to finish. One, the opening sequence is just I think amazing, and I think Mike Srago's kind of point is well taken there. It's it's almost as if it would be an a completely revolutionary movie if Tony Scott had kept up the style of that opening sequence, which is very impressionistic and kind of not I guess you could people use the you could talk about kind of music video directing and music video editing as this negative thing, but the opening of The Hunger is maybe one of the greatest examples of that that style of filmmaking, of narrative filmmaking. It's very evocative. It is very impressionistic. It does sort of in a it gets across what's going on, but leaves a lot of mystery to the story. We kind of have to fill in the details. It doesn't spell things out. It, interestingly enough, really anticipates in terms of the visual, both the visual style and the editing style. It anticipates the late Tony Scott style of his later work, which is really into that, that kind of blurry, kind of this blurry, smeary visuals with very fast-paced editing. And in a way, the opening of The Hunger is closer to, like, I think his later style, like the style of Deja Vu and Unstoppable and the Taking of Pelham remake, than a lot of the movies in between. He kind of seems to start in this really out there, pushing the limits in terms of what he can get away with. Um, Visually and storytelling wise, and then becomes a lot more conventional even in the course of The Hunger. As The Hunger goes on, it becomes a little bit more of a, it turns into more of a conventional movie, although still having its has its oddities or unconventional moments. But then goes on to do like Beverly Hills Cop 2 and Top Gun, which are pretty filmmaking wise, whatever their virtues are. And I actually don't like that kind of period of Tony's career is not my favorite. The kind of early commercial blockbuster period. Uh, that that stuff is seems to be, or rather, it seems to be, he starts at this. My point is just that he starts at this sort of pushing the boundaries and then backs off to have this commercial career, and then eventually, in the context of that commercial career, brings back those early interests or the early that early visual style in his later work. So I don't know if that quite followed along there, but that's kind of what I was thinking. I was watching it, and then as The Hunger progresses, it becomes more like one of the good mid-period works, like Revenge. A lot of kind of um, neo noir filmmaking choices visually and everything else. Sort of this expressionistic, heightened realism, or not realism, but this expressionistic, heightened sense of reality, not realistic at all. But and I like the movie overall. Actually, I should say, at some point I should say I think it's a pretty good movie. The ending, which is tacked on, is not good, and the kind of resolution of the entire way the resolution of the character is staged as it builds to the climax, I think, is, I love the special effects are great, the makeup effects are great, but maybe isn't as satisfying as it could be. But I think it's a pretty good movie with some a really compelling performance from Catherine Deneuve and Susan Sarandon there, and David Bowie is well used. It's kind of I liked it. It deserves its reputation, I think, as a cult classic at this point. The idea that it's, I think, Tony Scott's best movie, I don't think is tenable. But I think, or rather, I can see it being his best movie, but kind of not valuing any of the good stuff he does in his later movies, which I think, what I like about his later movies is has to do with his more kind of traditional Hollywood storytelling capability, or techniques, where he does, I think, tell these really rich stories in a very mainstream way. So he's still making very mainstream movies, but they have kind of richness around the edges. And I especially like in a movie like Unstoppable that there's a sense that all of the characters, even the supporting characters, really are given this sense of kind of being solidly there as characters, having kind of motivations and inner life. And he does this very he doesn't make a big deal out of it. It just kind of happens. And the part of it is the screenplays he's choosing, or the part of it is the screenwriters doing that work to make it happen. But it kind of happens consistently in his movie after movie, that I feel that it's also partly him kind of pushing for that. And the example I usually like to give is the way the movie Unstoppable treats the Kevin Corrigan character, who's this government regulator guy, and in any other movie, the government regulator guy would come in and he'd be the asshole that's stopping the hero or like kind of getting in the way of the heroes doing what they have to do. But here he's actually, he's we're meant to see that he's trying to help just like everyone else, and that he actually has a lot of good ideas. And that character takes on, even though he's not in the movie very much, takes on a real he takes on a real presence that in other movies it would be just a foil or just this kind of cutout character. And Tony Scott does that in movie after movie in his late work, and I think that is one of the things I really value in his work. And so that's not really in The Hunger at all. The Hunger is more an exercise in style and mood and atmosphere, and I think it's quite effective on those terms, but it's not as full an experience as a story as Tony Scott's later work, I think. So that's The Hunger. And then the other movie, another vampire movie from the 1980s, Near Dark, Kathryn Bigelow. This is one that I've always wanted to see, and again, I don't know why it's taken me so long to see it. It was one of the kind of movies that I remember Pauline Kael reviewing, or reading kind of Pauline Kael's positive review of it in, I think, her collection of 5001 Nights at the Movies, or I think that's where I read her little capsule review of it. And so it was always sort of on my list of movies I should see. And of course, I've liked Catherine Bigelow's other movies. I love Point Break, and I really think Strange Days is quite fascinating. I like The Hurt Locker, and I think Zero Dark 30 again is pretty fascinating, a pretty interesting movie. I like her submarine movie too a lot. So I like a lot of her movies. So I just why I never kind of got around to Near Dark until now, I don't know. It's a mystery. I think it's pretty. So I went back and looked at Pauline's review, and it is kind of focused on the atmosphere and then the kind of the cast work from the vampire crew. So if you haven't seen it, it's this hill. She calls it like a hillbilly vampire movie, but it's like one of the first it's in this vein of these kind of Midwest Western open space vampire movies, and you can think of like the Southwestern variation of that, like the From Dusk Till Dawn type situation, or John Carpenter's vampires are all sort of in this, um, you know, alternative kind of, a kind of, I don't want to say unconventional vampire movie, but just this idea that we're going to take the vampires and move them to like big, wide open American spaces, as opposed to kind of gothic, more gothic settings. Um, Anyways, that's kind of the subgenre Near Dark fits into. I don't know if we can probably think of some other movies that vampire movies that fit into that category. Maybe just the three of them, but who knows? Anyway, Pauline liked the kind of visuals, the atmosphere, and then she liked the characters of the vampires, like the performance of the vampires, like Bill Paxton and Jenny Wright and Lance Henriksen. She kind of talks about how they're an effective uh, group of kind of monster characters, and I think that's all true. And I liked, so I should say, like, I liked Near Dark, although. And I hate to be this guy because when other people are this guy, I'm usually the person kind of arguing against them or rolling my eyes at them. But I actually had a hard time with just the kind of plot holes and like I say, like I'm very forgiving, usually as a viewer. Like this, the kind of plot holes and like plausibility things like hardly ever bother me. I'm like, usually I'm like, this is a fantasy movie about vampires. Like who cares if it kind of makes sense or it doesn't all fit together, or like like it's not doesn't like ooh, the science behind it doesn't really follow. So what's my problem with it? Well, if kind of a spoiler, it's not really a spoiler, but a little bit of a spoiler. It's hard to take this idea that this vampire gang has been around for years and years, like being super successful, and has managed to like fight off all these, you know, survive despite all this carnage they're causing, and yet they kind of run into some like dumb, you know, Midwestern like cowboy kid, and like that's all it takes to completely unravel them and their little band, and everything falls apart. And it just seemed like they were pretty. It just seemed like, oh, for them, for the vampires to have actually survived that long, they should have been smarter than they are in the movie. They're kind of dumb. And like I say, I'm often the person like rolling my eyes when someone makes arguments like that. So I don't know what to say. It just, in this case, in this movie, watching it in this moment, I just felt that I couldn't quite go along with it. So it kept me at the level of kind of admiring it for its mood and its tone and the cinematography and things like that. And I did like the performances. So all the things that Pauline Kael mentioned in her review, I liked them. I responded to them to a certain extent. But then at some point, my engagement with the movie was just sort of blocked by that plausibility issue. I mean, like I say, I'm very forgiving usually, so I don't know what was going on. I should go back to say that with the hunger, I didn't really have a problem with plausibility. I felt that it really, and if we step back and, I could step back and think about it and say, like, the hunger probably doesn't make, if we've nitpicked, really wanted to be nitpicky about it, the hunger probably doesn't make any more sense than near dark, really. Because you can make the same argument, like, oh, similarly, like, oh, if she's so brilliant, why does she, Catherine Deneuve's character is such a mastermind. Why does she let herself into this? She makes some mistakes, and then in retrospect, you say, "Oh, she does make some mistakes." Like, oh, it's probably not a great idea to, try to go after a scientist who studies blood diseases if you're a vampire in a way. Like, I mean, she chooses in some ways a bad target, and you could say that's unwise. But in in the hunger, at least, it feels like that that lack of wisdom is part of the point, that she kind of does take this risk, or that she's driven by hunger and addiction, and it leads her to make these unwise decisions. So even if the theme of the movie, or the kind of narrative logic and thematic logic of the movie makes you feel that, oh, this is kind of what it's about. It's not so much implausible as it becomes about that issue. Whereas in Near Dark, it isn't. It doesn't feel that way. It feels more kind of haphazardly thought out. Like in Near Dark, the kind of plot happens because it has to happen that way, not because it's really kind of plausible or thematically resonant. So that's just what I have to say about that. I don't know if kind of thinking about them together illuminates anything. Sort of just random that I saw them recently, sort of back to back. So I don't know that but hopefully was able to kind of pull out some interesting things just by thinking about them and talking about them. Anyways, that's all I have. I've rambled on long enough about these two movies, and I will be back soon. Take care.